Welcome, thank you for joining us. I want to welcome you all to this installment of the Frontiers of Science lecture series. My name is Peter Trappa. I'm Dean of the College of Science here at the University of Utah. Many of you know that the Frontiers series is the longest continually running lecture series at the university. It was started over 50 years ago by Pete Gibbs, who was then chair of the physics department. And he had what at that time was a visionary idea of creating a public forum where the frontiers of science could be explored in all their glory. We're used to the ideas of public intellectuals, TED Talks nowadays, but back then it really was a very forward-looking idea. And in the intervening years, the series has expanded and hosted a great number of internationally prominent scientists from all corners of the globe, always focusing on the preeminence of the science. And in fact, I think over the years, there've been lectures by 23 Nobel laureates. This year, in the era of COVID, we've decided to partner with our friends over in the Alumni Association to use this webinar format to feature some of our own international superstar faculty in the lecture series this year. Many of you tuned in to our last Frontiers of Science lecture with distinguished faculty members in chemistry, talking about innovations in electrochemistry and applications to synthetic chemistry. And today, I'm very pleased that Bill Anderegg, assistant professor in the School of Biological Sciences, is with us today. Bill is, without a doubt, one of the world's leading forest ecologists. We're very lucky to have him on our faculty. Let me tell you a little bit about him before we get into the lecture. He did his undergraduate work at Stanford and completed his Ph.D. there in 2013. He then took a very prestigious postdoc at Princeton University before joining our faculty 5 or 6 years ago here at the university. It really is astounding the level of recognition and the awards that Bill has garnered in such a short amount of time. Let me tell you about a few of them. In 2014, he was awarded the Tansley Medal for outstanding contributions to plant science by an early career scholar. In 2016, this is when he was still at Princeton, or this was still in recognition for his work while he was at Princeton. He received the Blatnick Regional Award for Young Scientists, which is awarded to the top postdoctoral scholar in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. In 2016, he was awarded the Global Environmental Change Early Career Award from the American Geophysical Union, a very large professional society. In 2018, he was named an Early Career Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, and in 2018, he received the very prestigious distinction of being a Packard Foundation Fellow. We're going to hear a lot more about Bill's science and a little bit more about him. Let me tee things up a little bit. We know that forests around the world are increasingly exposed to drought. That's especially acute in North America. We see this in our own backyard. And Bill has established an international scientific reputation as a pioneer whose research links drought, tree mortality, and long-term climate change impacts on forests across many scales, the regional scale, continental, global scales. He's identified mechanistic features leading to death in trees under drought and their impacts now and for future climate change. And perhaps his most significant work is a unifying theory of how water movement through plants and photosynthesis in leaves are optimized, particularly in understanding how natural selection shapes the integration of form and function. So he and his collaborators have developed a unifying mathematical model integrating the essential structure and physiological features of gas exchange in plants, identifying how natural selection acts to shape plant response. This has overturned one of the most well-established previously adopted models, which had held for 40 years and is really paving the way for much future research. It's being widely adopted within plant biology because it unifies mathematically plant biology, ecology, and evolution. So we're in for a special treat with Professor Anderegg today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the format. We've put together a video with their friends over at University Marketing Communications. We're going to play that for about 5 minutes. That introduces some of the themes of Bill's work, tells you a little bit about his background and his journey in his research. And then at the conclusion of the video, Bill's going to make a deeper dive into his science through a slide presentation, and that will still leave us plenty of time for Q&A, which I will moderate for the remainder of the hour. So without further ado, let me once again welcome Professor Anderegg, and we'll get the video started. Thank you.
Trees are these incredible organisms. Aspen in particular, they have this interconnected root network. They're all the same organism, genetically identical. Any individual tree doesn't get to be that old, but the clone, the organism that's living underground and is sending up the stems, can live to be thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of years old. So it's potentially, we think, really one of the oldest, if not the oldest, type of organism on Earth. I grew up in Western Colorado and spent a lot of time in forests like these. When I was starting my graduate work, I actually came back to those same forests and found that a lot of places that I had spent time in as a kid were actually now more like moonscapes. The forests had died off, and there were, in essence, just these skeletal trees that were left of the places that I knew as a kid. That, I think, really started my path as a scientist. It sort of led to these very fundamental questions of what's going on here? You know, is this a sign of the future, and what can we do about it? We spend a lot of our time in sort of stressed and in some cases actually dying forests. When we see a stressed tree, we're going to take measurements on what's the water stress of this plant, carbon stress of this plant. Is it doing photosynthesis like a happy, healthy plant should be? Is it infected by any fungal pathogens or insects or viruses? All of these pieces help us build a picture based on fundamental plant physiology of, are these trees stressed or not? Are they going to survive now, this summer, next summer? What does the future hold in the next century? The Southwest and Utah are really kind of ground zero for climate change impacts. We see climate change in these fires, beetle outbreaks, and severe droughts. And this is really the canary in the coal mine. We're starting to see climate change play out, and the Southwest in particular.
I'm out there in the forest kind of witnessing firsthand how the trees do respond to climate change. So the University of Utah is a really great place to do this research and help answer these questions.
One really key piece of our research is understanding the physiology of how trees die. Trees have to pull water from the soil up to their leaves, and when the soil gets really dry, during a drought, and the atmosphere is also quite hot and dry, they're pulling harder and harder on the water until eventually these water columns in the tree, they break. Looking at that stress back in time and seeing how much of the water transport tissue is alive in trees. And to do that, we often core into the trees to take our measurements. Every year the tree grows a new ring, like pages on a book, and we can actually go back in time and look at how have these trees responded over the past 10, 50, 100, 200 years. This ability to have our incredible landscapes as our sort of our living laboratory, it's a really amazing strength of the U as a location and a research university, and of the College of Science and the School of Biological Sciences. Big picture finding is that this is really the tip of the iceberg, that this is kind of the start of a massive reshuffling of our landscape. Many days I'm hopeful for the future. I think I'm most hopeful getting to interact with students and with postdocs, and I also get really inspired, and I'm quite hopeful when I am teaching and interacting with all the incredible undergraduates we have. I think there's a lot of reasons for hope in the future. I do think that the single most important thing we can do to safeguard our West End landscapes is to reduce the speed of climate change.
Well, that was really an inspiring video. And now we're going to go into the next segment where Bill's going to share some slides and dive deeper into the science.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was an incredible introduction. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm excited to be with you and to share some of the really cool stuff that we are working on now and dive deeper into what we're working on and why it matters in all these different spheres. So, of course, the large-scale background here is that due to human emissions of greenhouse gases, temperature is rising on planet Earth. This is the global temperature record from NASA for the past 120 years. And this is going to have a huge array of impacts on many aspects of society, but for ecosystems in general and forests in particular, Earth's forests, this is the Amazon rainforest at dawn here, Earth's forests are really caught in this fundamental tug of war between two opposing sets of forces. On one hand, rising CO2 concentrations could benefit plants. It lets trees do more photosynthesis, potentially grow more. But on the other hand, the stresses that come with climate change, and in particular, drought, temperature, wildfires, pests and pathogens, and other disturbances are quite harmful to trees and to plants. And understanding in this tug of war when and where these different forces might win out and in which regions and in which tree species is one of the foundational questions of the field. It's something that scientists have been urgently racing to understand. Now, it has huge implications for a broad number of things we care about. It obviously matters for those forests themselves and the diversity of plant and animal species that inhabit them. It matters a lot for human societies that forests provide trillions of dollars every year in both direct goods, things like timber and fuel, and these more indirect services that are still economically incredibly valuable to us. So things like air and water purification, tourism are examples. And then finally, it's crucial to the climate itself, which is because Earth's forests are currently substantial sponges of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They take up more carbon and they store it and lock it up in tree trunks. And this is a huge benefit to us. It slows the speed of climate change. And in the sort of greener scenario here on the left, where forests continue to do well over the 21st century, that could help us tackle climate change. But in the sort of dying world, the browner scenario where forests succumb to these climate stresses and die off en masse in many regions. This is a photograph of beetle-killed forests in Colorado. That would actually potentially cause forests to flip and now actually lose more carbon to the atmosphere than they sequester. And that speeds up climate change, that makes climate change worse and has more these sort of manifold impacts for human society. So understanding across this spectrum from a greener to a more dead future, what are we looking at? And can we really make some forecasts and some projections based on fundamentals is really a central aim of our work and of many groups in the field. Now, this isn't hypothetical. These concerns about climate risks, I think, have been in the news and on everyone's mind quite a bit recently, whether it's these fires in the Amazon, massive wildfire seasons across the Western US, or severe drought or beetle outbreaks across the West as well. We see this playing out around us. And so there's a large concern, what might the future look like? We do know from a climate perspective that climate change is going to bring us more extreme events, and depending on where you are in the country, those will take different aspects will be more important. Here in the Southwest, obviously drought and fires are incredibly crucial. And here is an actual map of projections in a high climate change scenario by the end of the century. And this is showing you a very standard drought index. It's an agricultural drought index. The key thing to note here is that blue colors are where we expect systems to be a little bit wetter in a changing climate. And brown colors are where we expect more frequent and more severe droughts. We're obviously in the Southwest, it doesn't look quite as dire as, say, sort of Northern Africa and the Mediterranean, but we are nevertheless expecting a lot more frequent and severe droughts in the Southwest in the coming century in these high climate change scenarios. So the two, I would say, sort of summary critical questions that we try to tackle in our work is how can we really leverage and use the fundamentals of plant physiology and of forest ecology to really make rigorous predictions and projections of how individual trees respond to climate. And then secondly, once we know how an individual tree responds, how can we start to scale that up and make these same sorts of forecasts for whole forest ecosystems, for continents, and ultimately the globe? This is a challenge of both scaling in space, going from a tree to a forest to a continent, but it's also a challenge of scaling in time. We need to understand how a tree's response day to day or hour to hour, how is that going to play out over decades and ultimately the 21st century? To do this, we use a pretty broad array of approaches and data sets and tools, ranging from everything in the upper right. This is a cross-section of a set of tree rings where we're looking at the structure and the anatomy and the physiology of certain tree tissues. You can see this layered ring structure here in this photo, but you can also see in these white dots, those are these actual water transport cells. So we're able to really look at, even down to a cellular level, how are these trees responding. We use a lot of experiments as well. So in the lower left, this is a drought experiment that we've built in an aspen forest. And we do experiments both in the field, in the lab, and also in the greenhouses on smaller trees. We combine these with large-scale spatial data sets coming from satellites, coming from forest inventory data and tree rings. And that's what's shown in the upper left here. This is a satellite image of an ecosystem variable. And then we try to take all of this understanding and build it into these mathematical models that really try to predict how trees respond to the climate and how they grow and die. This is a computer visualization of one of these stand models that's growing two different types of tree species, the red and the blue tree species. And we're trying to use these models as a way to actually incorporate the best available science and get a snapshot, gaze through a very hazy crystal ball about what the future might hold. How do we do this? Well, these models are trying to incorporate in kind of the fundamentals of physics and biology. And to do that, and chemistry as well, to do that, they really need to capture some of the key fluxes of energy in forests, of water, and of carbon. And in particular, we've done a lot of work on this fundamentally linked set of fluxes of water loss from trees. I've highlighted this linked set in these red boxes here. Of water loss from trees, which is called transpiration, and photosynthesis, carbon uptake through leaves as well. And these two fluxes are incredibly important for how plants respond to the environment and how stressed they are. They're inherently coupled because they happen at the same place. They happen through these pores on leaves called stomata. This is a really incredible electron microscope image of a leaf surface, and you can see these pairs of cells that make up stomata. Incredibly important biological processes and how stomata respond to climate. And as Peter was mentioning, there's been a lot of work on stomata over the past 50 years or so. And in some of the work that we've been doing is really a lot of this work had missed some key pieces of plant physiology, of these components of how water is transported from the soil up to leaves and then ultimately lost to the atmosphere. And it missed some key pieces of the actual ecology of the system, which is that plants are not living in a vacuum. They don't have their own sort of bank account or bucket of water to draw upon, but actually they exist in an ecosystem. they exist and often compete for similar resources like light and like water. And so we've been developing this optimality framework that links the physiology, the ecology, and the evolution to actually predict how plants respond to different environmental conditions. And we've shown, I won't show you the data here, but I'm happy to talk about it. We've shown that when you incorporate in these key factors, our ability to predict how plants respond increases dramatically. This really helps in understanding and predicting how trees respond in a variable environment. Just to give you a vignette or two quickly on this second key question, how can we scale up? We've spent a lot of time thinking about what are the components of different ecosystems that make them more or less resilient to a changing climate. And it turns out that one really key piece of a forest ecosystem is the diversity of plant species present in it, or the diversity of tree species, of vascular plant species. And so this is a study we did a couple of years ago where we were actually able to use satellites that can look at the canopy water content of forests and actually all ecosystems globally. And we can use that to look at how resilient are ecosystems. And that's what this top left map is showing you, that warmer colors here in this color bar are more resilient ecosystems. And then this bottom map is our best estimates globally of the diversity of vascular plant species. And when you kind of compare these two maps for different biomes here, so I'm showing you on the horizontal axis, the diversity of plant species, and on the vertical axis, the drought resilience of two different forest biomes. We have the tropical forests on the upper right and boreal forests on the lower right. And the key take-home message of this, we actually did this with several other data sets as well, not just satellite data, is that all else being equal, when you have a forest with more vascular plant species, it tends to be more buffered and more resilient to drought stress. And this is actually has the biggest effects in these lower diversity forests like boreal forests. So that's an example of the scaling in space. How do we go from individual trees and species out to an ecosystem? In thinking about the scaling in time, we've recently been working on a project where we've been trying to ask, are multiple droughts more harmful to trees than just a single one-off drought of the same intensity? So this is a nice snapshot again of these same tree rings. And we asked this question both of individual trees through tree rings and of whole ecosystems using the same set of satellite metrics. Just to give you one quick flavor of the results here. So this is a bar graph where the further down the bar goes, the larger the drought impact in this forest ecosystem. These light red bars are the impact of the first drought that struck a forest, and the dark red bars are the impact of a subsequent or a later drought that happened anytime really between 2 and 20 years later. And then these different categories kind of move going from right to left, from more moderate to more severe droughts that struck. So we're being very careful in each of these to actually compare droughts of the same severity, right? We want to know if two droughts of the same severity actually have a more negative impact. And that is indeed the take-home finding. You can see all of these dark red bars are they go much further down. They have a much more negative impact. And we found this both at tree levels and ecosystem levels, that repeated droughts had a more negative impact on forests. That's particularly important in thinking about the future, because not only is climate change going to make individual droughts worse, more severe, but it's going to bring more frequent droughts in many regions like the Western US, which tells us that trees will be getting hit by droughts more and more often. Now, what do you do with all this information? This is kind of a final vein of our research, is that we're really excited about and invested in trying to take this cutting edge science and make it available to a huge range of stakeholders to actually use in planning the future. So we've recently launched this effort that we're calling the Forest Resilience Lab. And what we're actively working on right now is a sort of assessment of forest carbon stocks and how much carbon is in our forests and potentially could be in our forests under different scenarios for the US. We're pairing this with a really detailed assessment of what are these climate risks that forests face. And in particular, we're thinking about the risks of wildfire, of drought and climate stress, and of pests and pathogens. This is incredibly important information to have for a huge range of stakeholders, whether it's forest managers and landowners or carbon finance and carbon offsets markets. And then finally, we want to take all of these tools and these maps and these data sets and make them publicly available and easily usable by a huge range of folks. So we've teamed up with this nonprofit in the Bay Area called Carbon Plan to take the science that we produce and actually develop really nice and easy tool sets for folks to use. Just as an example of the types of data and data sets that we're thinking about on the risk side of things, this map on the right hand shows you the 100-year fire risk for different ecoregions across the US. And redder colors are a higher integrated 100-year fire risk. And the key point of this map is that many of these risks are increasing with a changing climate. So the top map is the fire risk that if you had extrapolated the same fire frequency and severity from 1984 to 2000 for the rest of the century. And the bottom map is from 2001 to 2017. And there's actually been about a doubling of these high severity fires over that period largely due to climate change. So these are the types of maps and data sets and products that we think are really important to get out there and to help folks plan where are forests going to be more resilient and where are they going to be more at risk or more vulnerable. So just to wrap up, I think the fate-averse forests in the 21st century still has a lot of uncertainty, and there's a lot that scientists are racing to understand. It of course hinges on human actions on climate change to a large degree, and how this fundamental tug of war between the benefits of CO2 and the damages of climate stress play out. I think we've made a lot of exciting strides at understanding and improving how individual trees respond. And we're now taking on this ambitious effort to scale up, improve, validate, and really roll out these tools at large scales to aid in planning for the real world response to climate change. Briefly, before I wrap up, this is an image of a Lego tree, and to some degree, we feel like we're assembling a little bit how trees work piece by piece. It's an incredibly daunting task, and I want to thank the huge number of students, technicians, and postdocs who have been involved in the work over the years. It's been an incredible group of people to work with them. I'm very fortunate. And I want to thank some of my collaborators and the folks who have funded the work over the years. And thank you for attending. I'm looking forward to the discussions and the Q&A.
Thank you, Bill. That was a marvelous overview and really inspiring in many ways. I was struck when you talk about the multi-scale analysis that you're doing. There's also kind of this intellectual multi-scaling going on. You're going from the very fundamental basic science to very applied applications, all within the umbrella of your work. Now, many scientists, such as myself, we're a little bit more siloed on the fundamental side or siloed on the applied side, but we really saw, and you really painted a beautiful picture for us of the entire spectrum of your work and your contributions. So one thing, so as Bill said, we're gonna turn this over to a Q&A discussion. Please consider putting your questions, people who are watching this in real time, putting your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to all of them. There are several hundred people who are tuned in at the moment, so we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'll do my best to do justice to the questions that you put in the chat. So to kind of lead off the Q&A, I just kind of want to build it on some of the themes that you talked about. So So what do you see as the particular set of challenges for our forests in the Western US in the coming decades, and how that might be informed by your multi-scale analysis and some of the diversity or lack of diversity that we have in our forests here in the West? So maybe you could lead off by speaking to that.
Yeah, we touched on this just a little bit in the video, but in essence, the Western US really face this kind of triple threat from climate change. And we have seen this play out in the past several decades already. In fact, I would say it's almost impossible not to drive a mountain highway in the Western US and actually see some aspects and some impacts already. These will be probably no surprise to everyone, but that triple threat is severe wildfire, drought stress, and then pests and pathogens. In particular, beetles in the West are the main kind of pests that we are concerned about. These are primarily bark beetles. They're mostly all native beetle species, but climate change lets these beetle populations grow and kind of explode and go into an epidemic phase. So I guess a different type of pandemic for the trees. So it's these three disturbances, climate change really ramps up and exacerbates, and that's what I think we're most concerned about. Now, there are ways to try to make our forests more resilient towards each of these threats, and a lot of them kind of are sort of common practices can help build resilience to multiple of these threats. There's a lot more research I think we need into understanding how and where to roll out these things, and it's also going to take a really concerted commitment from from Western U.S. stakeholders and land managers to roll out these techniques.
So maybe you could speak a little bit to individual mechanisms to increase the resilience. In fact, this is a little bit related to a question that came in from one of the viewers here. They were wondering if after a severe disturbance, after a big wildfire, does it ever make sense to come in with non-native species to increase resilience, or is that a strategy, or what are strategies that you see as important for increasing resiliency?
Yeah, it's a really great question. The non-native species one is sort of inherently context dependent, that maybe in the right places for the right reasons, it could make sense. In these sort of general principles of restoring forests and restoring ecosystems, I think we try to look at and consider native species first. There's a lot lower risks of something unintended happening. There are stories in the sort of invasive species literature of trying to do the right thing with a non-native species, maybe trying to control a pest or pathogen, and then it getting out of control. So I think where possible, native species probably make the most sense. But in terms of these broader resilience strategies, there's a whole suite of different actions. So in thinking about fire, for example, I think we can really get a lot of progress in kind of trying to restore some of the fire regimes that were around kind of pre-European settlement, building on some of the kind of local community and indigenous community knowledge around fire regimes. Some of this is kind of reducing stand density so that when fires strike, they don't completely immolate a landscape. Some of the work that we've done, and this meshes with lots of other work in forestry, is that often a diversity of species and a diversity of age classes can make a forest more resilient. That often the least resilient forest is a packed forest that's all the same age and the same species. And that's true for almost all of these disturbances, that the beetles tend to spread most when they have a really packed forest and can just move, like wildfire through a forest.
Yeah, you touched on this kind of ancient practice of controlled burns. I was visiting some friends in Montana who practice sustainable forestry, and the old growth was cleared about 100 years ago, and you can see these giant ponderosa stumps basically evenly spaced, almost like a park layout. And and they were cleared 100 years ago. And then in the intervening 100 years, you have this much more densely packed undergrowth, which is competing with the trees who aren't nearly getting as big. And we hear a lot about that with the wildfire season that we've just seen, that there isn't an understanding of forest management techniques, or there isn't the right effort being put into that. Is that accurate? Should we be, really investing more in forest management? How does that fit in with the resilience and the impact that we might have in increasing resiliency?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have these historical legacies that have set our forests up to be less resilient to these stresses, and fire suppression is an example of one. So I think we ought to be devoting a lot more focus and a lot more resources towards kind of proactive forest management and trying to really help forests be more resilient by thinking this through ahead of time, trying to restore these natural fire regimes, really trying to, often a term is adaptive management, where you're trying something, taking data, collecting, see how it works, and then you update your scheme. So this is a common sort of science-based management. These all make a ton of sense. They're often incredibly good economic investments. They pay back. Every dollar spent in creating more resilient forests tends to save many dollars down the road in fighting fires from less resilient forests. But we also can't lose track of that climate change is a big driver here. So for these massive wildfires, climate change is roughly behind half or more of the area burned. So these huge wildfire seasons like 2018 or 2020 are going to keep happening in a hotter climate. And so this is really kind of not an either or story. It's really we need to do both. We need to manage for more resilient forests, and we need to try to slow the speed of climate change so we don't see these devastating fire seasons year after year.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I mean, your slides really spoke to the complexity of the ecosystem. And so there's going to be no magic bullet here. And if someone suggests there is a magic bullet, probably you should keep your hand on your wallet or something like that. I want to pivot to a different set of questions. We saw one of your PhD students talking in the video, saw the collection of your students and postdocs in your last slide, in one of your last slides. Can you talk a little bit about how you engage students in your research and maybe the feedback that you have between being an educator and a researcher, and how the educational side of your professional life informs your research, and how your research informs your educational portfolio? Maybe you could spend a little time talking through that for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think students are really critical to all aspects of our research, and they're involved in the sort of data collection, both in the field. We do a lot of work in our local ecosystems. This is an incredible place to be an ecologist in Utah, and we work in Utah and Colorado quite a bit. Students are involved in the sort of processing and physiology in the lab and the data analysis and the kind of ultimate rollout of the results. And I think that that's maybe one of my favorite parts of my job, is getting to interact with and do science with our students. There's this really nice feedback, I think, between the education side and the research side of our work, and that's that, a lot of times we'll be talking about some of these same ideas or concepts in a large class. So I teach a global environmental issues class that covers many of these key climate change drivers. And the issues and the questions that come up in class are often so incredibly on point for what the research is, and vice versa, right? We're covering a lot of the research in class as well. And so there's this really cool sort of synergy between the students, both who are in the lab, but also the students in the classroom thinking through these things. We've definitely had instances where really excellent projects in the class or really excellent questions in the class have prompted us to think about, hey, we should go research that, or I wonder if someone could look at and test that. I think it's an incredible benefit of getting to spend time teaching these sorts of things to our undergraduate and graduate students.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, we are constrained, of course, in the middle of this pandemic. We've got a light at the end of the tunnel with the great news about the vaccines. But there's been so much discussion about what the future of higher ed will hold. It seems to me, and perhaps I'm biased here, I have to admit that this experiential component of the kind that you're describing can never be replaced or even reasonably approximated online. And that's something that's going to be central to the higher education, to the landscape of higher education for a long time to come. Even as we'll see lots of changes and positive changes that the online experiments that we're seeing today are having. We're getting some great questions coming in from the chat, and I'm going to turn to those in a moment. But I want to bring up another idea that we hear popularized a great deal. I remember when I was a postdoc at the Institute in Princeton, and I remember distinctly Freeman Dyson, the great theoretical physicist, holding court at lunch one day as he was thinking about possible actions to combat climate change, and he had this idea of planting. I think at that time it was 1 billion trees, but now it's turned into the Trillion Tree Initiative. Maybe you could talk about what does replanting trees in the spirit of the Trillion Tree Initiative provide a viable and perhaps immediate answer to addressing some of the climate change issues that we've been talking about here?
Sure. Yeah, this is something that we're very interested in. We're kind of actively working on what's the scope for forests to help us solve climate change. So I guess the headline answer here is that yes, forests are already helping us slow climate change, and there is some scope for both stopping the loss of forests. I think that's probably got to be an even higher priority, keeping mature forests around and not being cut down around the world. Currently, deforestation is 10 to 15% of human carbon emissions. So if we were to decrease that, that's already some help. And restoring and replanting forests where they have been lost. The key things to keep in mind here is that it's not, like you were saying, it's not a silver bullet. It's one arrow in the quiver in essence. So really, I think a huge concerted investment is going to also get us maybe 10 to 20% of the way there to solving climate change. Each one of these technologies is, no single one is going to help us solve climate change. We really need a huge array of strategies, and trees can be one of those strategies. Now, to do that, you have to do it well and based on the best available science, which means we want to know where trees can be grown, that they will store carbon and lock up that carbon for a long time, and where they're not at high risk for then going up in flames 20 to 30, 40 years down the road, right? It's not just the planting trees, it's also, you have to grow them and keep them alive for centuries. And I think that's the final point, is that planting trees today is definitely a great idea. It's one of these things, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. Same for tackling climate change, but it isn't an immediate solution. So trees take decades to grow pretty large and to lock up carbon. So these large tree planting initiatives now aren't going to make an immediate impact on climate change. They're going to make an impact, 30 to 50 years down the road.
Yeah, all the trees I plant in my backyard to screen from my neighbor. I look at them every year and I wish they'd grow faster.
Well, one nice example is, if you wanted to think about how many trees it would take to plant in your backyard to offset your own carbon footprint. So this is kind of just a nice ballpark calculation that you can do, is that so the average tree in an urban setting, when it gets to like, a medium mature age, stores about 88 pounds of CO2 a year, right? The average American's carbon footprint is on ballpark of about 40,000 pounds a year. And so if you just do the math, you'd have to plant and keep growing about 500 trees per person to offset that. So this is, that's obviously not feasible for the vast majority of people. So it's a good idea, but it's not going to solve climate change on its own.
Right. And that touches on a question that came in about urban forests. Let me turn to some of these that are coming in from people watching in real time here. So, you have that really interesting set of slides where you overlay diversity and resilience. And this kind of drills down on that a little bit. So how do the changes in Western forests compare to other forests around the world? Are all experiencing similar effects? Can we learn from some response someplace and bring those ideas, transplant so to speak, the ideas that are being successful one place to forests in other regions of the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is definitely some ability to learn from other forests and to kind of compare notes and figure out what is happening. Broadly speaking, we are seeing pretty similar climate impacts on other temperate forests around the world. And we actually did a paper last year trying to look at where are tree species dying within their geographic range, and across the world, both here in the West and basically almost every other biome, they're dying at the hottest and driest edges, and they're kind of dying, their geographic ranges are shrinking from those hot and dry edges. And so there are a lot of parallels as to how different species and different forests are responding. It's probably cleanest and easiest to kind of compare insights across temperate forests. So we compare a lot our Western US forests to Southern Europe and forests across, Spain, Italy, and the Mediterranean. Places in Australia have pretty similar climate and climate dynamics. It's likely that as you move towards very different biomes, like the boreal forests or the very diverse tropical forests, that those have a lot of different dynamics and also very different climate stresses. So our Western US forests are kind of most comparable to these other temperate forests.
Very interesting. Okay, so here's another one that came in from one of our viewers. So kind of more practically oriented. So we're talking about a lot of large scale phenomena. However, would you say that there are individual actions that we can take here in Utah to keep forest death under control in our own backyard, so to speak, in the Wasatch Frontier? Maybe you could speak a little bit to that. I mean, I think that's a very practical question when people read about, some of these devastating effects that we've been talking about, and walk the forest as you did in Western Colorado and see the devastation. What is there something that what steps should individuals be taking? Or can they be taking?
Yeah, there are definitely lots of steps that we can take, and it does vary a little bit based on the tree species and kind of the ecology of that specific species. But broadly speaking, trying to kind of reestablish these more pre-European fire regimes. We can think about trying to thin densities down to, like, especially in these ponderosa pine woodlands, getting densities back towards more of what we think they were as of 1800 for a kind of undisturbed ponderosa woodland. I think there's very practical steps we can take to reduce human exposure to some of these things, and thinking about defensible space and fire hardening of this interface where humans are kind of exposed to some of the risks of wildfires. I think maybe the broad scale thing I would say is that the more we can be proactive and devote kind of the resources and the effort needed to plan this today and thinking about what climate change is going to bring down the pipeline, the better off we will be, and the less we'll be in this reactive zone of just fighting fires year after year or seeing a new beetle tear across a landscape.
Yeah, so here's another one that came in, and this really gets to kind of the multi-scale data issues around data sets from which you're inferring you're performing multi-scale analysis on. So I'll read it to make sure that I captured it faithfully. So what are your strategies to collect spatially representative field data and to scale them to a large scale reliably, for example, regionally or continentally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So for some data sets, like satellites, for example, you have the nice advantage that you get wall-to-wall coverage. You get complete coverage of the Earth at some spatial and temporal resolution. For these field data sets, some of them, we use a lot this forest inventory and analysis data set that's kind of curated and run by the US Forest Service. It's an incredibly useful data set for forest ecologists because it's actually on a random grid across the whole US. So that's sort of the dream setup that everywhere randomly selected is being measured, because then you have this ability to generalize and scale. For our field studies, if you're going to go drive up into the mountains, and particularly the more detailed the study, if we're doing a lot of equipment to measure plant physiology, it's a lot harder to get that sort of stratified random sample. We don't have the luxury of doing a 2-day backpacking trip into our randomly selected sites. So in those cases, we try to do sort of a stratified random sample where we're looking at within sites that we can reach, we'll have some random selection of where our plots go, and then we're only able to really kind of scale within these elevation bands and things like that. So we try to be pretty careful about that. There's obviously kind of multi-scale statistical approaches you can do too, that if you have some maybe not randomly distributed, some sort of biased set of field measurements, but you have satellite measurements that go everywhere, there are kind of ways then to map and upscale.
So here's another one that came in real time here, actually two that are fairly closely related. So I hope I capture them and do them justice. It's much easier to hand a microphone to someone and let them do the asking. So these two questions are asking about biodiversity of plants and soil on the latitude scale and altitudinal scale, and there's a very specific question that can you discuss tree species that are shifting altitudinally, latitudinally in Utah environment right now due to some of these climate changes that we've been discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have worked a lot on aspen forests in Utah and Colorado, and there's also been a huge amount of work on pinyon and juniper woodlands, and we are working in southern Utah as well on some of those systems. And it's very, very clear with the drought impacts we've seen in the past 20 years that this is one of the mechanisms driving these shifts in geographic ranges. This is because drought seems to hit forests really hard at the hottest and driest sites where those trees are found. So in our aspen case, actually, we've basically, over the roughly 15 years that we've been doing this work, we've seen these aspen forests die off at low elevations, and literally it's kind of shrinking uphill. There used to be aspen forests at these low elevations, and the drought has largely killed them. We've been trying to track in these areas what's coming up after. Do you see other species moving in? And the initial answer is not yet, that we don't see some of these lower elevation tree species coming in. Actually, for the case of Utah juniper, it is primarily dying off at its low elevation limit as well, especially from the recent 2018 drought. So 2018 was a very bad year in southern Utah, and we've seen quite a bit of Utah juniper death. Utah juniper is basically the drought hardiest tree, one of the drought hardiest trees in the Southwest. And so there aren't trees that live at hotter and drier sites. So as it kind of dies from low elevations, it's not going to be a woodland anymore. It'll be a grassland or sagebrush.
Very interesting. Well, we're coming up on our time here, and I covered a tremendous amount of ground. I want to thank you, Bill, for all the insights that you've given us, given our people who've joined us on the call, and this will be made available. This recording will be made available, so we'll be able to, people who weren't here in real time will be able to view it as well. So thank you once again, Bill. I'm so grateful that you were able to spend time with us and share, you really world-class, inspiring research with us today. I want to remind everyone that we will have another installment of the Frontiers of Science. Our next installment will be February 18th. We'll have distinguished professor of mathematics, Ken Golden. He's going to be talking about his work about mathematical modeling of sea ice. The title is very provocative. It's called On Thinning Ice. So look for that on February 18th. Once again, thank you, Bill, and thanks to all of you who joined us today.